All right, Jamie, welcome to the podcast. It is brilliant to have you on the show.
Thanks so much for having me, Alex. It's pleasure to be here and to catch up with you again.
Yeah, and we're kind of talking obviously about breathwork today, which is, I think, one of both of our favorite sort of topics, sort of in that area. But before we dive into it, for those that might not be yet familiar with sort of you and what you do, are you happy just to do a little bit of an intro and background?
Yeah, for sure. So I am a breathwork coach, facilitator, practitioner. I think I'm still kind of deciding, it changes every day which word I attach to the term breathwork to describe what I do, but it takes many different forms. I started my business, the Breath Space, just over 2 years ago. I work with individuals one-to-one. I work with groups. I work with businesses, with athletes, all centered around the weird and wonderful world of breath and how we can use this extremely simple tool to tap into our physiology, to tap into our psychology. It's been a really interesting journey. I came to breathwork through my own experiences with it, as I was navigating some particularly challenging times with my own sort of mental and emotional well-being. Haven't really looked back. I came from a pretty traditional corporate background, and life looks extremely different now, and much the better for it. So no, it's been a great sort of, I'd say, 4 years of change in my life, both personally and professionally, and breathwork's been a big part of that.
And how do you sort of first come across it? I'm always intrigued by people's kind of first experience with the breath.
Well, I think anybody who's familiar with the world of breathwork at a slightly deeper level, or even not a slightly deeper level, will have heard the name Richie Bostock at some point, aka the breath guy. One of the nicest people you'll ever meet, but also just one of the most brilliant practitioners that you'll come across in this space as well. And I was navigating a really tricky period, probably the lowest part of my life to date, and hopefully the lowest part of my life ever. But I was deep in the midst of severe anxiety and panic attacks, and I was having kind of near daily panic attacks, sometimes more than a few a day. And I went on this sort of, it's the only word for it really, this journey of sorts where I was just trying to help myself and really get curious with what could help me. So I sort of went back into CBT and talking therapy. I got very into meditation, into yoga, and just got very curious going inwards to see what might help. And I was training pretty regularly at a studio near where I live now, actually. And the head trainer there, a guy called Christian, we got on really well and still know each other pretty well now. And he said, "Oh, why don't you stick around for breathwork?" And I just sort of said, "Nah, I'm all right. I don't know what it is, and I don't care." And I was just like, okay. But there was something. I think it was, I don't know. I trust his opinion very highly and value his opinion. And so I think there was a little seed planted there where I was like, maybe I'll give this a try at some point, but I'm not there yet. And then it kept coming back into my awareness and back into my mind. And then I thought, you know what? It's straight after a class that I'm already doing. Why don't I just stick around and give it a go? And that was with Richie. And it just hooked me. It drew me in. I think the physicality of it, the sort of the visceral physical sensations that can show up during a breathwork experience are what capture a lot of people's attention, because there's no denying the somatic experience. You can't say, "Oh, that was weird, but maybe it was my mind just making it up." Like, it's very physical, it's very real, it's very tangible. And so that stayed with me, and then I just stuck with it. It was a weekly session, became a bit of a weekly ritual for me. And over a period of probably sort of 6 to 9 months, I just started going deeper and deeper and deeper into that work, and had some really pretty profound and transformative experiences that put me on the path to where I am now.
Amazing. Yeah, and I think once you have that sort of consistent breath practice, whether it's, in a class with others or whether it's at home, ultimately, at least from my perspective, it is kind of like peeling back the layers of an onion. So, you have the capacity to go that little bit deeper. You feel a little bit more comfortable with those sort of quite unique experiences, and it sort of just starts to organically unfold from there. Is that sort of something that you found?
Absolutely. And I think in a way, I was actually teaching a seminar last night on sort of the foundations of breath work. And it's a message that I always try and get across is it's as if as soon as you step into that space, whether it's kind of functional breathing, performance breathing, transformational style breath work, any kind of breath related practice, once you step into that room, you've lifted a lid on an awareness of your breathing that perhaps you didn't have before. So we go from being completely unconscious and unaware of our breath to suddenly thinking about it. And that can be pretty revelatory because you're suddenly aware of the influence and the role that something that you've been doing for the majority of your life without having to think about it can actually shift and change things for you. And so that definitely was the case for me, was sort of this lifting the lid on a very positive version of Pandora's box. And that really was part of the big shifts in myself, I think. And yeah, when it comes to, I guess, these deeper modalities of breath work, yeah, it really did it took me because it was just getting more familiar with what it felt like and more curious with the experience. And I think these styles of breathwork have this unique ability to open us up to whatever is underneath. And so that varies and changes with every experience. And so it's almost like oh my God, I wonder what's going to happen this time. I wonder what's going to happen here. And almost as best you can, trying to suspend your expectations and go, I am kind of here, open to whatever will be. And that can bring up a certain amount of resistance, right? But if you can start to get comfortable with that, that really, I think, is where the magic lies as well. So yeah, it's a rabbit hole of the best kind, in my opinion.
Yeah, and I think I'll get this right, but there's a saying sort of in plant medicine, which is, for example, psilocybin is a generalized amplifier of sort of consciousness. And I think, whatever tool you use to get into those slightly altered states of consciousness, that's often what it is. So I love the way that you kind of put that. Whatever is kind of bubbling under the surface, and that changes day to day, week to week, month to month, you're just more likely to become aware of what truly is there.
Yeah, and I love that the amplifier, because I think particularly, it's no secret that in the Western world, especially, we are experts at staying in our heads. And I always say in my sessions, you're using your breath as a vehicle to move out of your head into your body. You're handing the keys over from the mind to the body and tapping into the wisdom and the trauma in some cases that the body holds. And so if you are able to sort of stay with the breath, trust the breath, allow the breath to do the work for you, you are opening yourself up just to see what's there. And I think it's very hard, again, as people who spend a lot of time in our heads, myself included, to say, okay, I'm just going to allow whatever shows up to show up. Instantly, kind of at the start of a session, as the facilitator starts explaining what you're going to be doing, there's going to be narratives and expectations of like, oh, I hope this shows up, or oh, I hope I can work through this, and oh, I hope I cry, or I hope I tingle. And as soon as you start doing that, which is human and natural, you're already trying to steer the experience, when actually what we're looking to do is take our hands off the wheel and let the breath drive for a little bit. So yeah, it's fascinating. It's such an interesting way to work with our bodies and work with our minds.
Yeah, and I'm obviously at the beginning of my journey in the breath, really, but I am just fascinated by what you can see in others when you are facilitating them breathing. Everything from facial expressions, to how wide they can open the mouth. There's so much that you instantly learn about someone when they just are breathing. And it's such a beautiful thing to, I think, witness ultimately. But do you see that kind of correlation, I guess, between, we're talking about sort of letting go and surrendering to the breath and our capacity to do that, and how that mirrors our capacity to kind of let go and surrender to life while still obviously wanting to move in the right direction in life?
Absolutely. I think that you hit the nail on the head. I think observing the journey, the process that someone goes through as they breathe, and watching how they breathe in that capacity and how their body shifts and moves. And for some people, there'll be like almost like a tightening and a closing, and that just, it is completely mirroring what's going on for them internally as well. The body starts to mimic whatever the natural kind of inner experience is. And yeah, I think the thing that shows up more often than not for a lot of people is these control patterns that we have, our desire to keep everything in check, and our desire as humans for certainty in terms of where things are going in a quite a logical, methodical process. And the breath kind of tries to pull us out of that. But then there's this battle, this kind of locking of horns, where the mind hates that and the body wants that. And so you get in this push-pull, and that's where a lot of the resistance can show up, especially in the early stages of a breathwork experience, where the mind is starting to get a little bit quieter, but before it does, it likes to fight back and get a little bit louder. And that, I think, is really fascinating to see someone go through this process of almost fighting within themselves, and then reaching this point where it seems to break through almost in a way. And there's, you see the shoulders drop and the body open and the breath deepen and the mouth widen and the emotion comes, the laughter comes, the smile. There's nothing I love more than seeing just like a huge, completely inexplicable grin on someone's face during an experience. I'm just like, I can't wait to hear what's going on here later. So yeah, it's amazing just to see how much the breath can tell us. And this applies outside of kind of these deeper experiences as well, actually just looking at how someone breathes and being able to actually tell quite a lot about how they conduct themselves as a person. I think if we can, I always talk about learning to speak the language of the breath. And I think that's a really powerful way just to engage with your own breath, is actually, okay, am I breathing short and shallow and quite tightly at the moment? What is showing up in my life that's reflecting that? Where am I feeling tightness? Where am I feeling constricted? Where am I feeling trapped? And then starting to address that through breath practices to actually help yourself move beyond some of those emotions, some of those feelings as well.
Beautiful. Yeah, and I think that's so true. Your breath to breath, moment to moment, or daily breath, however you want to describe it, is just as illuminating in regards to what's going on. But you mentioned earlier also, I guess the different ways we can use the breath, the different types of breath ultimately. So do you want to just kind of break that down a little bit as well?
For sure. So I'm always quick to, I suppose, what's the word? Quick to point out this is my version of events. This is by no means kind of dogma or gospel. But I personally believe, from my own experiences over the last 4 or so years, that, breath work as a term has gotten more popular, but also as a result more broad in terms of what that term means, and more vague as a result of that breadth. I have started talking about full spectrum breath work. So this end-to-end capacity to understand every different possible meaning of that term, because I think, if I always say, if you asked 5 different breathwork practitioners what breathwork is, you'd probably get a variety of answers across those 5 people. And that's not a problem, but I think when it comes to messaging and getting the word out there needs to be a little bit more clarity. So for me, breathwork is sort of an umbrella term, covers any way that we can use our breath, use our breathing to shift our state physically, mentally, or emotionally. So working on those 3 levels, maybe even including spiritually as kind of a 4th level. Within that, it ranges from, as you just touched on, kind of day-to-day, moment to moment. How are you breathing as you go about your day, at rest, during exercise, during sleep, as you sit at your laptop working? How are you breathing? And is that optimal for your physical, mental, emotional, spiritual well-being? And if it's not, what can you do to address that? So kind of looking at functional breathing, your respiratory health, your respiratory function. That for me is almost like one of the foundational pillars, is that awareness of your breath, and then learning how to shift and change that. You then have, I think, probably what a lot of people in wider society might associate with breath work, which is breathing exercises. So looking at nervous system regulation, looking at the role of the breath within the nervous system to shift our state. So simple techniques that a lot of people now are very familiar with, like box breathing, like coherent breathing, resonant breathing, where we're just looking to manipulate the 4 parts of the breath, the inhale, the hold, the exhale, and the hold, to create a desired shift in state. So that could be to calm the nervous system, to feel more relaxed, to help us sleep, or that could be to upregulate. That could be to find energy, to boost stress resilience, whatever it might be. So simple changes in the breath that can create profound changes within our state. And then the stuff that I guess we've spent most of our time so far talking about, which is what I would refer to as, the deeper modalities of breathwork, healing modalities of breathwork, transformational style breathwork. I like to call it numinous breathwork. Basically just these experiences, these journeys into altered states of consciousness, emotional healing, somatic-led healing. And so it's a broad spectrum, because, telling someone to breathe lightly, slowly, and deeply through their nose while they're sat at their desk is very different to somebody having an emotional cathartic release through a 60-minute breathwork journey, one-to-one or in a group setting. So it really, there's a lot to it, even though it is literally working with those 4 parts of our natural breath. And I think that's kind of the magic of it. I think a lot of people like to get quite stuck or be very, very committed to a certain style of breath. And I think the magic, certainly from my perspective, lies in our ability to understand it all and appreciate it all. So yeah, that's kind of my take.
No, it's beautiful. I think really helpful to show that there's that breadth to breath work. There's kind of something for everyone. And even though, as you say, the instructions might be different, whether you're nasal breathing, mouth breathing, etc., they all have a purpose to play within someone's health journey, whether, as you say, that's physical health, mental health, emotional health, or spiritual health. And as you said there as well, the accessibility of it, I think, is one of the things that always people comment on, the fact that, oh my God, this is available to me. These experiences are available to me just by tweaking the breath and letting go, ultimately.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting, because it's something that I've certainly noticed in myself and in others, is that as a society, we love convenience, but we also don't trust anything if it's too simple. Yeah. It's like, I don't want it to be too complicated, because that's too hard and I'll never stick to it. But if it's too simple, surely it can't work. And breathwork seems to find itself down here, because, it's everyone who works in this space knows the number of times that you'll hear, but it's just breathing. And the answer is yes, but it's like, yes, it is just breathing. However, you can do this, 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 and this. And if you try it for 1 minute, you will know that that is true. And so I think that is it's sort of so accessible, so easy to engage with, but occasionally can be viewed as too simple for its own good. It's just like, oh, surely that can't work. But it can, and it does. And I think we're starting to see that traction build as people go. And I think this is maybe a slight aside, but I think hopefully relevant, that so many of the practices that we're now seeing get all of this, mainstream Western acknowledgement are some of the most fundamental, basic, natural human practices ever. Getting in cold water, changing your breathing, working with heat. It's not working with your circadian rhythm, getting sunlight in your eyes in the morning and the evening. These are so basic, but so transformative that it's almost like, what have we been doing? what have we been doing for the last 100 years, even longer, that has got us to this point where we're so stuck in tech and we're so stuck in accessibility and convenience that we're forgetting our roots, we're forgetting where we came from, and we're forgetting that the basic stuff works. And if you have that foundation of basics, then the rest just sort of starts to fall into place.
I mean, this is a really, really important point, and I think a really fascinating one. It's something I was thinking about not that long ago, because I think sometimes there is, as you say, resistance to things that are sort of a little bit easy or convenient. You know, I can even think about myself and the breath. Like, there are still days where I'm just like, oh, you know, sitting by myself for half an hour. Oh, I could do it, but there's just resistance there. And especially, I think, from a sort of a physical health perspective, someone's dealing with a chronic health issue. At least from my experience, I think there's often times when for some reason, we're almost actively trying to overcomplicate it. It's almost like it's a deterrent, or it's a reason to not go where we need to go. And obviously the concept of breath work and altered states of consciousness can be scary, because a lot of us are going to be concerned about what could come up if we were to let go and allow ourselves to express, you know, whether that's emotion, anger, pure joy and bliss, whatever it may be. But I think it's such a powerful thing to consider and just sit with, you know, the fact that we all seem to need to intellectualize these things. You know, I need to know why this is going to work before I'm actually going to do it. So
yeah, that last point as well is it's one I grapple with really regularly. I was saying to you before we started that I'd been thinking for a little while about doing a master's in neuroscience. And, you know, I'm very, very curious about all of this. And, you know, as with most people I know nowadays, big Andrew Huberman fan, and all of this kind of fascination, this genuine fascination that I have with the mind, and wanting to understand both my own inner workings, but also those of people that I work with. However, I remember speaking with Alan Dolan, who I did my conscious connected breathwork training with, about the science of conscious connected breathwork and these healing modalities of breathwork, because it's no secret to those in the space that the research is not really there. It's now starting to be done by amazing people like Richie. And I'll be really intrigued to see what comes of it. But I remember speaking to Alan and his opinion, and I know the opinion actually of a lot of the original kind of rebirthing breathworkers, holotropic breathworkers, is that the science doesn't really matter. If we know that it's safe and we see that it works, it's experiential evidence rather than evidence-based and science-based. Why do we need the science? And I think it's that sort of modern, sort of millennial Western desire to have to understand why. And I think there's benefits to both sides. I would love to see the evidence. I would love to see what is actually going on, because it just not only soothes my imposter syndrome, but also allows us to kind of explain it and take it. I think if you ever want to take something mass scale in today's society, you need that there, because no one, and that's how you tap into more of the skeptics, into more of like the middle of the market, the people who are resistant to it because it's a little bit out there and it's a little bit spooky and a little bit scary. If you can put some evidence in front of them and say, we know that this is why it's happening and this is the benefit that it could have for you, people will go, okay, I'll give that a try. Whereas if you're just saying like, this could happen and it could help you, and look at this person and look at this person, people are always going to raise an eyebrow in certain containers. So I think that's why research and science is good and almost necessary in some ways. But at the same time, you and I have both felt personally the impact and seen firsthand the impact in others, to the point where it's almost like, yeah, science is great, but you can't explain that. You can't explain what I've just seen happen in this person and the shifts that they've experienced in their life. And so, yeah, I'm always coming back and forth on like this need to understand, this need to intellectualize, but also just knowing, like more of an intuitive knowing and from experience that I've seen what this can do, and that's enough. And kind of, yeah, always fighting that slight internal battle of whether we need it.
Yeah, no, it's a really good point. And I think, it's a tricky one, because I'm not sure, for probably the first time, I don't feel necessarily, I think, the need for the evidence. I think you're the evidence, Jamie. I think I'm the evidence. Like, speak to Katie, my wife, about how I've changed over 2 years of going on breath days and retreats and things like this. And as you say, that's certainly enough for me. It would be really interesting to know, obviously, what's happening in things like the brain and stuff like this. But I think it's also a symptom of what you said earlier, which is, in the modern world, most of us are stuck in our heads. And is it because we are just disconnected from our bodies and that deep intuition and knowledge that, potentially Indigenous communities still have to a much greater capacity than we do? That connection with nature, that connection with the seasons, and just ultimately, I guess, that ancient wisdom, that intuition that so many of us lack, I think, in the modern world, and trusting that, being able to sit in the gray and the unknown in comfort is such a skill that can be developed, I think, through these sorts of practices. But it's trusting, it's having that faith almost to go there in the first place at the moment.
Absolutely. And I think that for me has certainly been a learning recently in so many different areas of my life around this ability, or somewhat lacking inability to live in the gray. I think we are, particularly in our society, hardwired to strive for certainty. And I actually think it's where so much of our suffering comes from, is striving for certainty in a world that guarantees a level of uncertainty. We're always looking for black or white, and we're then presented with gray and we go, oh fuck, the gray again. And it's almost getting comfortable in that uncertainty and going, okay, I always say this, and it becomes a cliche, but it is what it is. And that is the crux of it. Like, you cannot get certainty where there is none to be found. And the more you strive for it, the more disappointed and the more you'll suffer.
Yeah, friction is a word I use a lot. You can sometimes feel it in people when they're seeking that certainty, and they're just not finding it. And there's just more and more friction with life. And that distress causes more symptoms, more frustration, and we just start moving further away from where we need to be. And for me, certainly, I felt this in sessions, and I've seen it whereby, and you've kind of touched on this previously, those moments when you have the aha moment where you're like, okay, I understand. And there's something that is ineffable, I think, about those experiences. You can't put words to it, but there's those moments where everything becomes just that little bit clearer. And then I think the task is to somehow stay with that and integrate it into our normal existence, which is the challenge.
Yeah, well, that's the word, right? Integrate. I think with any practice that taps into an altered state of any kind, there's a risk of chasing the feeling. And I think we certainly see it with plant medicine, and we occasionally with any kind of altered state modality of, people just want to go back to that place. And there's a great quote that I heard in an interview with Jamie Wheel and Jason Silver. It's a podcast episode I've listened to probably 5 or more times. And it's a quote from Houston Smith that says, how might we turn our passing illuminations into our abiding lights? So how, essentially, this question of how, and this is Houston Smith again, how do we go from altered states to altered traits? Which I love, because it's the question. Because when you tap into that place, that ineffable place, where whether it's a realization, a feeling, an insight, whatever it is, that is something, and this is the nature of altered states, is that is not accessible from your normal waking state consciousness. And so when you come back down to earth, when you come back down to the space that you naturally occupy and inhabit, how can you integrate that? And that's the ongoing question, is like, how can you take that passing illumination and integrate it into your life? Because that for me was one of the most transformative breathwork experiences that I had, again with Richie, in a big group session. It was a men's event, and the only way I can explain it and describe it is that I felt joy and bliss and euphoria in that experience that I hadn't felt in living memory. I think I must have felt it and experienced it as a child, but I'd lost any contact with that level of happiness, that level of joy. And as someone who had been to the depths of depression, that was a game changer, because it changed my perception of reality. I was like, okay, that's possible. I suddenly knew it was possible. I spend my time listening to Jason Silva quite a lot, and he talks about this idea of knowledge by acquaintance. So you can have knowledge by description, where someone tells you something. Someone goes, hey, Jamie, did you know you can feel pure joy? And I go, okay, cool, great. Thanks for telling me. And it never quite sticks. It never lands. But through altered state experiences, you can get knowledge by acquaintance, which is actually being properly acquainted with that knowledge, with that experience, the fact that that joy is possible. And that has so much more power, because it's a lived experience of that revelation. And so when you do arrive back in normal waking state consciousness, you have that knowledge, you have that appreciation, that understanding that, hey, okay, I am safe, or I can feel joy, or I can let go of that thing. And because you've had that physical somatic experience of that, it becomes a lot easier to integrate. But integration is no easy feat. And I think that with any kind of altered state experience, is the question is, how can we make the most of what we get from these experiences and not just leave them in the experience? And I think it's almost what happens after the experience that is as important, if not more important, than the experience itself.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, it's almost a bi-directional relationship, I think, in the sense that what you experience in those slightly altered states is, or can be, certainly in my experience, like a mirror of kind of where you're at in life at the same time. So I just think of some of my experiences that so mirror what was going on in day-to-day life, and your ability to go to some of those places is, like we said earlier, related to your capacity to let go in day-to-day life, for example. But I think integration is something that I've thought of quite a lot recently, especially. And one of the challenges, I guess, is the fact that so many of us are going back to lives that are just not compatible with how humans should be living fundamentally. Do we have a really strong, close social network? Do we have people that we trust and we can talk about these sorts of experiences with? Do we have people that understand these experiences? Or are we just getting up, going to work, coming back, drinking wine because we're depressed, because we don't have purpose or satisfaction in jobs? And it's a sort of a Groundhog Day scenario ultimately. And I think that's one of the concerns I have with kind of the psychedelic renaissance to some degree, which is people going and have these sometimes beautiful, obviously sometimes challenging experiences, but they're not necessarily even having the network and the infrastructure post these experiences. And obviously I think it's slightly different to breathwork in regards to just the magnitude to some degree of the experience, but it's still true to some degree for breathwork, for altered states of consciousness, but also just for general health.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you're totally right. I think oftentimes I think, again, plant medicine more so than breathwork in a lot of ways, because, as you said, of the magnitude. And oftentimes I think people arrive at experiences with medicine and psychedelics expecting that the medicine is going to create the change. And actually all the medicine will do is show you what needs to change, or give you insight into a change that could be possible, and maybe something that you want, or something that lives within the subconscious. And then if you go back and you're not willing to make that change, or your system and your structures don't allow you to make that change for whatever reason, it can actually be it can leave you in a worse position. And I think that's where we have to be really careful and really responsible with psychedelic experiences, because it can be a really, really bumpy landing if you're not prepared to genuinely make change. And I think that's why, you know, for example, with things like ayahuasca, that can be such a profound experience. That's why people talk about, you know, getting the call. When you feel like you're absolutely ready for that experience and ready to rip up the playbook and turn your life on its head, potentially, that's when you go, not on a whim, when you're just like, oh, this will be interesting, because that's where things can get really dangerous in some cases, if you're just left completely scrambled with no means with which to properly integrate. So yeah, I think it's really, really important to go into any altered state experience with that knowledge that things might need to change as a result of that experience, and being willing to create that change. There's another quote that I love from a guy called Chris Letherby that says, the power of altered states of consciousness is in their ability to violate our expectations of reality. And so that violation is not necessarily comfortable. It's not necessarily something that you want to see. You know, they always say in psychedelic spaces, you don't get what you want, you get what you need. And that's not always comfortable. It's rarely comfortable. And so you have to be prepared for that eventuality. It's not all going to be sunshine and rainbows, and you need to kind of be prepared for whatever comes up.
And that's obviously, you know, for those that are somewhat familiar with the psychedelic space, this concept of preparation and integration. And going through sort of the practitioner training program, there were some assignments all of sort of around preparation, integration, things like this. And at least I started to really think about how those should just be, to some degree, natural components of life. You know, I can't quite remember who discussed this, but talking about integration of the knowledge and the experience and the insight that can come from slightly altered states of consciousness. You know, it's almost you're metabolizing that information and embodying it in your day to day. But how well do you do that in other life events? You know, whether it's the birth of a child, the loss of a family or loved one, you know, this is the same sort of principle and energy and the same process that we have to think about. So preparation and integration of life events and life generally, you know, we need to just integrate all of these things into our existence.
Yeah, it's brought up so many things in my mind, because I remember a coach, still my coach actually. I went and gave a talk about breathwork, and I was on the train home, and I felt incredible. I felt amazing in my body, in my mind. I just felt at peace. I felt an element of kind of bliss. And I got home and I started walking along the river, and there was an amazing sunset, and I just sat. And I spoke to him the next day. I was just like, I want more of that. In the same way that you might in a breathwork experience, in a psychedelic experience, you have this illumination and you go, oh, how do I create more of that in my life? Which I guess is integration, part of integration, right? And his suggestion was to write down everything that happened that day, and almost make a log of like, okay, what were the conditions that created that reality, and how can I start to create more of that? And I think that is really empowering at because altered states, and this is why I like the term altered states, because, you know, quite often people will be like, breathwork can create psychedelic states. And I'm like, yes, but it's more about altered states, because if you label something psychedelic, people are expecting a trip, people are expecting visuals, people are expecting a bit of weirdness, but that's not necessarily what an altered state is. Altered state just is any kind of change in your perception and your state within your normal waking state reality. And I think you can kind of have micro altered states and macro altered states. And I think integration and preparation can be a really cool and interesting and profound part of any of those. So whether it is just, you know, you get to the end of the day and you're like, that was a really good day, or you finish a workout and you go, I was so in flow, and integrate that. Why was it? Because that's what allows you to make the most of these things. I think a lot of altered states become a little bit meaningless if you don't take anything away from them. They become an escape from reality rather than a way to change your reality. So yeah, it's really, really interesting. I think, yeah, big life events, just good feelings, almost stepping away and going, okay, let's not just leave that there. Let's think about how I can carry this forward and carry it into the rest of my life. Yeah, I like that. I'm going to take that away from this.
Yeah, I mean, I think these sorts of conversations and these sorts of experiences are paramount, and they used to be more prominent. Especially in sort of the men's space, they talk about the rites of passage, for example, that we now is kind of your rugby initiation at university. I mean, that's about as bad as it gets, or as it gets. So I think bringing these kind of things back and at key kind of life stages is such a profound way to nurture the development of the younger generations and to have a positive impact on, ultimately, I guess, society at a larger level.
Yeah, I think I certainly underestimated and really ultimately didn't really have any knowledge of any kind of ritual, any kind of initiation, any kind of rite of passage. And I think, unfortunately, what that leads to in society at large, but I'm going to talk about men's work here specifically, is men who get to my age, get to 28, get to 30, get to 35, and they are still a living embodiment of a teenager. They are, in their own minds and probably in how they show up in the world, showing up as a child to a degree. And I only feel comfortable saying this because that's me as well. And it's only been in the last year that I've actually taken steps to address that and grow up, which seems like a ridiculous thing to say as a 28-year-old, but I stand by it. And yeah, I think underestimating as well the power of having, elders in your life as well, older people that you can learn from, look to, lean on. And, we always laugh about kind of respect your elders, but I think there is a real lack of respect for our elders because the world has changed so much that there's a little bit of disconnect between generations and almost a feeling like, oh, what do they know? They're out of touch. They know a huge amount about life, about the world, and it might not align with your worldviews, but that is totally okay. That's where we learn, because we need differences in opinion and we need to get out of our echo chambers. And yeah, then ritual, I think, is a massive one. Almost this ability through challenge and through trial to show to yourself, not about anybody else, show to yourself the strength of your own mind. I think there's a huge amount of power and confidence that comes from proving that to yourself. I had an experience about a month ago where I did a Native American sweat lodge for the first time. Wow. And I would encourage, well, when you feel the time is right, speaking of answering the call, when you feel called to do it, I would really encourage everybody to experience it, because it was probably one of the most physically and mentally challenging things I've ever done, but subsequently one of the most rewarding things that I've ever completed, because I came out the other side and I went, I did that. And it starts to strip away some of that layering around feeling like you're a boy, feeling like you're not enough, feeling like you're not a man, whatever it might be. And it doesn't have to look like that for everybody. It doesn't have to be that level of challenge or that thing, but there are things that we can start to look at that can help to build us into that version of ourselves that we want to become. And I think that's really empowering.
Yeah. And it's kind of, I guess I envision it as those sort of stepping stones, as you say, what evidence do I have that I am this person, I'm becoming this person, etc. That's beautiful.
Yeah, I think that is amazing that you put it like that, because that was the thing. So for me, going into that experience, I had a belief about myself through experiences with sport, experiences with fitness, that I was pretty weak-willed. That was the belief I held about myself, that I gave up pretty easy when things got tough. And I was sat in this sweat lodge, and all I could hear repeating in my mind was Muhammad Ali saying, I'm going to show you how great I am. And that was all I could hear. And actually, I found the experience challenging, but I was never once about to leave and step out of the experience. And I came out of it, and all of a sudden, I just had this evidence that the belief that I held about myself wasn't as true as I thought it was. And that, to me, is the nature of growth and personal development, is gaining evidence that a limiting belief that you hold might not be true. I think that's the beauty of experiences like that, is you start to build that bank of evidence.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's it, I guess. I think so much can come back to how strongly we attach to stuff, basically, whether it's a thought, a belief, a material object, etc. And being able to just have those experiences as a way to, if nothing else, even soften, to sort of let go a little bit. It comes back to what you were saying there. So yeah, I think these events, these experiences are so important, especially in today's sort of society and with where the world is. Arguably, they're even more important in some ways.
Yeah, and I guess it sort of almost comes a little bit full circle back to the conversation we had about these natural practices that everyone's getting back into. Is we're starting to see, I think this happens in any time of life, but where we see this countercultural reaction to, technology going up and up and up. And as a result, people going, no, I need to go the other way. I need to go the other way. And so we get back in touch with nature. We get back in touch with ceremony. We get back in touch with ancestry and cold water and breath and the basics. And there's always that kind of ebb and flow of, as things get more advanced, people go, oh, what about this in the other direction? And yeah, it's really exciting to see. I think, especially in the UK, we seem to have lost touch completely with any form of I guess, tribal culture and ancestral culture. And, it's so, I so admire it. And I know so many other people that admire those elements of Central and South America and Asia and Africa. You've got these kind of real deep ancestral roots and practices and ceremonies that have stood the test of time. And yet in the UK, that seems to be, it's like a missing link. And it's not that it was never here. It's just that we have seemed to have lost touch with it. And there's some amazing people, doing amazing work, kind of re-engaging with that part of this part of the world. And maybe, there's a bit of a hope that we won't have to disappear to the other side of the world to get in touch with that part of ourselves. And I think that's really, really special to start seeing develop.
Yeah, I'm so glad you brought that up, because I've been thinking about that quite a lot, especially some of the stuff that came up during sort of the synthesis practitioner program was kind of around that, and I think it's hard to find people in the UK who you can go to. Our elders is a way of thinking about it, I guess. But I'm super intrigued and interested in finding resources to learn about that. I'm called Irish, half Greek, so I'm also really intrigued about sort of the Greek side of things. What were rituals, what was done back in the day from that perspective that we can sort of reignite and connect with? Because I always remember listening to a podcast once which was along the lines of that. If you go and do ayahuasca in South America, you're connecting with that medicine, with that plant, with that spirit, and it's not necessarily as sort of compatible, so to speak. You're coming back to a completely different space, and that really kind of resonated with me in regards to how we should probably move forward with these things as well.
Yeah, and I think those experiences and those cultures are so much more readily available and accepted on a world sort of scale. But I agree, there's almost that nature of, thinking about it from like a nutrition perspective and eating local produce and not eating foods that come from the other side of the world, because that's not compatible with our biology, because we were, our lineage is here and our biology is here. So I do think, it's going to take some time for that to start to establish itself in this part of the world. But I think when it does happen, which it's starting to, it's going to be really special, because I think it allows us to honor and tap into something that I think for a lot of us is missing. Even a conversation about your ancestry and your kind of familial lineage is quite far removed from where we are in the UK, especially. And I think, yeah, I'm half Scottish, half English, and I think any kind of Celtic roots are really interesting to explore from that perspective as well, because there's so much magic there that I have no idea about, but I know it's like that, again, that intuitive knowing that there is stuff there. And you know, people like Eddie Elsie, and I met a guy called John who ran the sweat lodge that I did, who is from Liverpool, and I don't want to offend him, I reckon he's probably in his 50s or 60s, and he has that real sort of elder vibe to him. And it's slightly different, I think, to, you know, going to Central America and spending time in those communities. And that's beautiful. But actually, I think what you end up seeing is then the people that return from those experiences and want to share these practices are sharing, and almost, and in no negative way at all, but they end up almost going into that energy. They go into the energy of the South American tribes or the Central American tribes, and they're sharing that wisdom and that connection, which is beautiful and valuable. But surely, I'm hypothesizing here, surely it's got to be more aligned to do it from a place of your own biological heritage. So yeah, not a conversation I thought we'd end up having, but one I'm very glad that we are having. So yeah, it's going to be amazing to see how it develops.
Yeah, definitely. It's exciting. I'm mindful of time, Jamie. Is there anything we haven't sort of touched on that you kind of just want to maybe conclude with or emphasize?
Sure, I'm sure I can think of something. I think the thing that I'm always super conscious to emphasize is, I guess, to do with the world of breathwork. I think I'm very aware of the popularity of breathwork at the moment, and it's a brilliant thing. I think with that popularity comes some challenges, as people feel a little bit potentially overwhelmed on who they should work with and what kind of breathwork they should do, and lots of questions like that. And I think when it comes to these deeper experiences with breath, as a potential participant or someone who wants to experience it, the number one thing that you should be looking for is somebody that you feel safe with. I don't think it necessarily matters what school they're trained in, as long as they have a training that provides them with the correct knowledge to be able to hold a safe space. And that's a whole conversation entirely about the world of breathwork courses at the moment. But you just should feel safe. And that is the number one priority. So if you are curious, try different styles, work with different practitioners. It's about who resonates with you, and it's about making sure that you feel safe in that space. And I think that's got to be the number one priority. And I think that's just an important note to share. And I'm fully aware, you know, within that, there'll be people who, for whatever reason in their own lives, might not feel safe practicing with me. I hope most people would, but for whatever reasons, people might not, and that's totally okay. And there will be people that they do feel safe with, and that's the important thing. So I think that's probably, yeah, the thing that I'd like to leave with people as well when it comes to these practices.
Yeah, I think that's a really important message to share with people who are now going to go out there and go, oh my God, breathwork sounds amazing. Jamie, thank you so much for coming on. It's been awesome to chat with you, and hopefully we can do it again in a not too distant future.
Absolutely, mate. No, it's been a real pleasure. Thank you so much for having me. And yeah, I'm going to integrate this experience because I feel excellent. So I'm going to go and figure out exactly what happened, because I don't think I can always have you on speed dial to put me in that state. So yeah, thank you so much, mate.
Brilliant. I'll share the recording with you and you can listen back.
Brilliant. Thanks, man.